Good morning and welcome to OLLI at Berkeley's Friday Special Event Series. My name is Matt. I'm the curriculum coordinator here at OLLI, and we're happy to see you here on this beautiful Friday morning. Today we're welcoming Jack Glaser. He's a professor of public policy at UC Berkeley. He's a social psychologist whose primary research interest is in stereotyping, prejudice, and discrimination. In particular, he's interested in racial profiling, especially as it relates to the psychology of stereotyping. Jack is the author of Suspect Race, Causes and Consequences of Racial Profiling. And this is part of our America's Unfinished Work series, where we hope to foster awareness in eradicating systemic racism. Today's talk is called Racial Bias in Policing. And please type questions into the chat, and Jack can take them at the end of the hour. But Jack, it's all up to you now.
Thank you, Matt. Hello, everybody. Good morning. Thank you for having me, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to talk to you about my work and how it relates to what we see going on in the world and in the United States in particular with respect to racial disparities in policing, in who get stopped and searched and arrested and have force used against them and the like. And so what I'm going to do is start by sharing my screen. And I will start this presentation. And I'm going to start with an apology, which is that I am going to cover a lot of information. I probably have too many slides, but I want to go through an arc of a discussion. And so some things I'm going to go through kind of quickly. They're there for you to see, but it's really more like just a backup for the discussion. And the arc that I want to cover is to talk about my area of expertise in terms of my doctoral training, which is in racial and ethnic stereotyping and prejudice, and particularly how it operates implicitly or outside of conscious awareness and control. And then talk about how that relates to what we're seeing in policing, and then talk about some things that we can hope to do about that and some things that are being done about it. And I'm going to focus primarily on the role of discretion in policing, because police have a lot of discretion in their day-to-day activities. And that seems to be where a lot of the racial disparities are coming out of. And so I'm going to cover all of that. But I'm not going to get into great depth on some of the topics, and I apologize in advance. And I'm happy to take questions or follow up with additional email conversations for people who want greater depth on those things. So I'm going to start with this image, and I have a question for you, which if we were in person, I would ask for hands, a show of hands and the like. But for now, we'll sort of simulate that discussion, and I'll just state the question, which is, do you see a triangle? Or maybe two triangles? And typically everybody says, yes, they definitely see a triangle. And in fact, you might see one here, you might see one here. But if we think about the formal definition of a triangle, which is something that has three contiguous sides and corners or angles, then that's not actually present here. And yet our minds fill in the gap and see triangles, even though they're only suggested. You may even think that it looks a little bit lighter on this side relative to this side. I don't know. I actually see a differentiation. But in fact, this figure was made by placing these 6 figures and not by putting a white triangle over something else. And that's the reason I start out with this, is to point out that that's the way our minds work psychologically. We are rarely, if ever, given complete information, whether it be a visual object or a concept. And we have to make inferences and fill in gaps. And those inferences ideally lead us to correct judgments about what we're encountering. And that's true for physical objects, and it's also true for other people and concepts. And this all leads to the notion that bias, the stereotypes and prejudices that we have, are actually normal. They're part of normal human cognition. But they stem from normal processes like our tendency to categorize physical objects like triangles and circles, but also people from different groups. And also a fundamental tendency to favor people who belong to the groups that we belong to, or at least we believe them to belong to those groups. A tendency for us to perceive correlations between things in general, but specifically between people and certain characteristics. And again, as I said before, this tendency for us to make judgments with incomplete information, which is something we absolutely have to be able to do, because as I mentioned before, we almost never have all the information we would need to make an unambiguous judgment about what somebody's going to do, who they are, where they're from, or even the shape of an object in front of us. So these are all completely normal, but they're not necessarily desirable. And in a contemporary society where most of us value equal opportunity and equal outcomes for people, these biases mitigate against that. What we've learned in recent decades is that these biases that we have, the beliefs and the attitudes that we have toward different groups, other groups, operate largely outside of conscious awareness and control. And so we refer to this as implicit and automatic processing. And so whereas we do know some of the stereotypes, for example, that we have of some groups, we don't know all of them, or even if we know them, we might disavow them consciously, but they can still unconsciously influence how we interpret other people's behaviors. The reason that we know that a lot of our cognition operates outside of our conscious awareness and control is based on, I'm a social psychologist, but I'm going to talk here about cognitive psychological research, but decades of cognitive psychology, some of which started here at UC Berkeley, that has looked at the operation of memory and how we perceive things, how we store them in our memory, how we encode them, and how we retrieve them from our memories, and how much, if not most of that, operates outside of conscious awareness and control. The reason we know that is that cognitive psychologists have developed really clever methodologies for providing concrete evidence that we are actually able to process the meaning of stimuli, of images and concepts and words, even though we have no conscious awareness of experiencing or perceiving them. So for example, in this particular research paradigm, the word stem completion paradigm, people are asked to fill in a word stem like H blank T with the first letter that comes to mind. And you can see I've chosen a simple one here that has lots of valid solutions. Unbeknownst to the people in these kinds of studies, they're being subliminally exposed to images like this. And by subliminal, I mean they're being shown them for just a few milliseconds. So they have no conscious subjective experience of seeing anything, let alone what it was. Nevertheless, somebody who's flashed briefly this image is more likely to fill this in with an O, or in this case with a U, or in this case with an A. And what this tells us is that people are processing the meaning of things that they have no conscious awareness of being exposed to. And that meaning is causing them to disambiguate some other stimulus in a manner that is conceptually aligned with what they didn't even know that they saw. And that means that we are thinking unconsciously. And it turns out that this is true not only for how we process images and objects, but how we process people as well. And before I move on to talk about our what we call implicit social cognition, how we think about other people and how our unconscious processes influence that, I want to point out that it's not just the importance of these discoveries in social psychology and the application of the cognitive psychological research to the social psychology of intergroup stereotyping and prejudice is not just that it gives us a way of measuring people's biases that circumvent their attempts to present themselves as unbiased, but that it really speaks to biases that people have that they're not aware that they have that could be influencing them and causing them to discriminate despite their conscious intentions to behave in an unbiased and egalitarian manner. And that's something that in my work early on became particularly relevant to understanding the persistent disparities we see in policing outcomes. Now, before I go any further with that, I want to say that as somebody who's been studying implicit bias for about 25 years and been applying that to policing for about 20 years or more now, one thing that I've come to appreciate over the last few decades, and particularly in the last decade or so, is that while I do continue to believe that implicit bias plays an important role in the disparities we see in law enforcement, as well as education, healthcare, and lots of mortgage lending and lots of other domains, as important as it is, what I've been humbled by in working with police departments and advocacy groups and the like is the limited value of implicit bias for explaining the massive disparities that we see. And what I'm coming around to is an understanding that much of the disparities we see are structural and systemic. Nevertheless, there's a feedback loop between the biases and the systemic problems that are mutually reinforcing. And so I think it's important to study all of them. But at the end of this talk, I'm essentially going to talk about a much more structural response, which is, again, to rein in the discretion or constrain the discretion that police officers have in how they carry out their duties. So back to implicit bias, there's now a large and continually growing body of research showing that the measures that social psychological scientists have developed to index implicit biases, so we can actually score people on how strong their biases are toward gender groups or racial or ethnic groups. Those measures do in fact correlate with behavioral outcomes like employment decisions around, based on the ethnicity associated with a resume that's been submitted, but real world behavior, including voting behavior in the 2008 election when we had a Black and white candidate in the presidential election. And I'm going to highlight one of these studies because I think it's a particularly good illustration of how this works. This is a study by medical researchers in collaboration with social psychologists, looking where they, and I'm not going to get into the weeds of what this image shows, but it's basically the template for something called the implicit association test, where people see lots of Black and white people's faces and they categorize them on race. And they also see positive and negative words that they categorize as good or bad. And the psychologists make an inference about the strength of their implicit anti-Black, pro-white, or vice versa bias based on their relative facility when you combine the Black or white faces with the good or the bad words on the same response key. And what these researchers found was that with actual medical residents on a cardiac rotation, that the strength of their implicit anti-Black bias, which is on the horizontal axis here from low bias to high bias, so higher numbers here mean more anti-implicit Black bias, that the strength of that bias was related to their decisions to provide an appropriate treatment for a patient who was presenting with some cardiac symptoms and this treatment of thrombolysis, but it was differentiated as a function of the race of the patient that they were presented with. So for residents who were presented with a white defendant, sorry, I do a lot of criminal justice work, a white patient, the more anti-Black implicit bias that they had, the more likely they were to recommend this treatment. And for the residents who were presented with a Black patient, the more anti-Black bias they had, the less likely they were to recommend this treatment, which maps onto a fair amount of actual archival medical treatment data that shows racial disparities in who gets treatment that can be explained by lots of different things. So these implicit biases matter. They relate to behavior. Some of the more rigorous studies have shown using multivariate models that they are causally related. And then with respect to policing, my colleagues, Jennifer Eberhardt and Phil Goff and others have done research that really builds on everything that I've been talking about to show how racial stereotypes and biases can relate to policing-like decisions. So in this experiment, as one example, people are asked to make a judgment as they see an image become decreasingly pixelated, like this. They're asked to judge, these are the first, middle, and last frames, but there are many in between. So this gradually, as people see this on their computer monitor, it becomes gradually less ambiguous. And they're asked to identify whether it's a crime-related object or a non-crime related object as quickly as they can. A lot like the word STEM completion paradigm I showed you before, unbeknownst to these research participants, they're being subliminally exposed to Black people's faces or white people's faces prior to making these judgments. And what these researchers found was that people are faster to judge objects as crime related when they've been subliminally exposed to Black faces than when they've been subliminally exposed to neutral primes or white faces. Similarly, Josh Correll and his colleagues have studied what they call the police officer's dilemma, or we generally call shooter bias now, which is the speed and accuracy with which people shoot people who are armed versus unarmed, or make the decision to not shoot those who are unarmed. And what they find generally, these are just 4 examples of many images that are used in these studies. What they find generally is that people are faster to shoot armed Blacks than armed whites, and more likely to make the error of shooting unarmed Blacks than shooting unarmed whites. And my colleague, Eric Knowles, a Berkeley PhD now at NYU, and I have shown that an implicit association between Blacks and weapons predicts the strength of this shooter bias, that it is driven not by the Black, white, good, bad bias, but by the specific race weapon association. And in fact, it turns out that police officers have these stereotypes as well. They're normal people with normal cognition, and specific research has shown that police officer samples exhibit similar patterns of results. So Correll, as well as Ashby Plant and her colleagues, have shown that police officers exhibit shooter bias in these simulations. And that experiment that I just described by Eberhardt and Goff and colleagues has also been replicated with police officers. So subliminally exposed to Black faces are faster to identify crime-related objects than when subliminally exposed to neutral objects or white faces. This may help to explain what we see in the real world data with respect to the rates at which fatal officer-involved shootings involve Black, white, or other victims. And so, for example, if we look at the data that has been compiled by the Washington Post over the last 6 or so years, we see that among those who are fatally shot by the police, Blacks are almost twice as likely as whites to be unarmed. So this is a compelling piece of evidence that that kind of shooter bias is occurring in the field. More pervasive, as horrible and tragic as fatal officer-involved shootings are, a much more pervasive phenomenon in policing is just the daily encounters of stops, pedestrian and vehicle stops and searches, some of which lead to arrests and some of which lead to use of force as well. But we have thousands of these occurring every day in the United States, and even in New York City, thousands occurring every day just in New York City alone, under the stop, question, and frisk regime that was going on there, and that peaked in 2011 with nearly 700,000 pedestrian stops of civilians in New York City, and for a number of reasons has declined dramatically in the years since, one of which was a successful civil action lawsuit against the city. I can talk more about that later on. I've had some involvement in that. It's been really interesting. But if we look at that peak year, we dig a little bit deeper, we see that that those stops were disproportionately of Black people, and then also disproportionately of Hispanics and much less commonly of white New Yorkers. But the overwhelmingly most common rationale provided by police for those stops is something that they call furtive movements, which is an inherently subjective thing, that they are looking at somebody on the street and see their behavior as furtive, whether they're they're glancing around or they seem to be concealing something, and that is the basis for the stop. So that sort of starts to give me and others an idea that there's a lot of subjectivity going on in these stops that may be driving these racial disparities. If we look at what happens during these stops, we see again that Black people are disproportionately, they're about a quarter of the city's population, but half of the stops that are occurring. So they're twice as likely to be stopped as one would expect based on population. Among those who are stopped, Blacks and Hispanics are more likely than whites to be frisked, and they're more likely to have force used against them than whites. But interestingly, they're somewhat less likely to be arrested, conditional upon being stopped. And that's in spite of the fact that for various reasons, including socioeconomic reasons, they're more likely to have outstanding warrants and holds. And so all else being equal, being stopped and searched by the police we would expect whites to be less likely to be arrested. And when we dig again a little bit deeper there, we see that among those who are frisked by NYPD in that peak year of 2011, and by the way, the data looked very similar for most years until very recently, and I'll show you some data on that. But among those who are frisked by the NYPD, whites are more likely, twice as likely to yield contraband or non-gun weapons. Gun yields are extremely low overall, which is a whole other story and questions and calls into question the whole purpose of stop and frisk. And again, in spite of the lower rates of warrants and holds, whites who are stopped and frisked are more likely to be arrested. And this is what we call an outcome test, which is something used across many domains to study discrimination. And the basic insight here is that while we don't know the underlying rates at which people are offending, so we can't say that disparate rates of stops and frisk necessarily mean discrimination, these differential rates of outcomes of contraband and weapon yields resulting from frisks strongly suggest that whites who are frisked, stopped and frisked, are have to present with higher objective levels of suspiciousness in order to be frisked in the first place, and that's why their searches are more fruitful. So this is very strong evidence of discriminatory judgments in who gets stopped and frisked in New York. And we see that pattern of results, those higher rates, outcomes, search yields for whites relative to Blacks and Hispanics across many different jurisdictions. And I'll show you statewide in California in a little bit. So what drives these disparities? Well, as I said before, I think structural inequities do a lot to drive these disparities. And then of course, complementary to that are the individual biases that officers hold or that complainants who are reporting suspected crimes to the police hold. So another way to think about this is that if you have a disparity between two groups in terms of their criminal justice outcomes, so for example, if you see higher per capita rates of arrests for Blacks than whites in New York City or anywhere else, that may be caused by a lot of different things. So it could be caused just by deployment patterns where more officers are being deployed to certain neighborhoods or majority Black neighborhoods. And that is just mathematically going to cause disparities. And I'm going to illustrate that shortly as well. It could be that the police are prioritizing different crime categories, like crack versus powder cocaine or other differences. It could be that officers have bias, and I'm going to drill down deeper into that bar shortly. It could also be that people who are reporting crime or calling 911 are biased as well. And it could be that there are differential offending rates between groups, which may be driven by differential educational opportunities, employment opportunities, parental incarceration rates, etc. But if we dig down deeper into this officer bias, recognizing again that structural factors are at least as important, probably much more important. But if we want to figure out what can be done about policing, and we look at the officer level, we recognize that there are multiple decision points along the way when officers are deciding who to police. So they're deciding who to surveil, They're deciding among those they surveil who to stop. And then among those they stop, who to search and other things, and whether or not to arrest and whether or not to use force. So getting back to this, the idea that differential deployment rates or officer bias will alone cause the disparities, even if there are no differences in groups offending rates. If we imagine that we have two groups, maybe whites and non-whites, or maybe blacks and whites, and we'll just set everybody aside for now. But you have these two groups, one of which is smaller than the other, which has 30 or 300 or 30,000 or 3 million people in it, and the other group has 6 million people in it. And we say, as a thought experiment, that these groups have the same rate of offenders. So 20% of each group is an offender for some crime, and that might be speeding, or it might be possession of illicit drugs, or unregistered weapons, or whatever, or some combination of all of these things. So that if they were randomly stopped by the police and searched, about 20% of those who were stopped would be found to be in possession of some evidence of a crime and might be arrested. Now, if that minority group is the object of more attention because police are deployed in greater numbers to their neighborhoods, et cetera, and so half of them are stopped over some period of time, a number that might sound ridiculous on its face, but again, if you look at the NYPD numbers, is not actually the idea that half of a group would be stopped in a year or something like that. It's not at all ridiculous. But only a quarter of the other group are stopped. And they both have 20% of them are offenders. The statistic that will result from this is that 10% of the minority group will be arrested, and only 5% of the majority group will be arrested. And then when you look at criminal justice statistics, it'll show that that the rate of arrest, and what some people will infer from that to mean the rate of offending, will look twice as high for the minority group, which will be purely a function of policing decisions and not of underlying offending rates. This is compounded by the fact that the central legal construct in police decisions about who to stop and search, reasonable suspicion, is an inherently vague construct. The term reasonable is vague unto itself, and then the idea of suspicion is something that people don't particularly understand very well. And there's a lot of variation across police departments. So there's variation in the specificity of the policies and the prescriptiveness and proscriptiveness of those policies about who can be stopped and searched. There's variation in how rigorous their training is and what kinds of incentives and priorities, both in both directions, incentives to be fair, but also incentives to yield a lot of weapon fines or make a lot of arrests. So just as a quick example from the policy analyses that, or policy reviews that my team has done of various police departments, here's the main language on reasonable suspicion for two different police departments, one of which just simply says an officer may conduct field interviews I've blocked my own view of this. Excuse me, I can't read my own thing. There we go. So one of which says, an officer may conduct field interviews or stops when he reasonably believes that some investigative inquiry is warranted. So it's very circular. The reasonable suspicion standard is when you reasonably believe. This other department gets very, very prescriptive and proscriptive, saying the department is committed. They state their values, are committed to unbiased policing. No person shall be singled out or treated differently, blah, 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 et cetera. So here we have just two departments, these are mid-sized city municipal police departments with dramatically different stated policies. And then, as I said before, the training that they do, which is very much at the level of, at the discretion of the department, also varies dramatically. So I want to shift a little bit now and talk about, because we're talking about how officer bias may influence these decisions, and because it turns out that police departments all over the US are paying millions of dollars for what's called implicit bias training, we need to think about whether there is much that can be done to move implicit biases around or interrupt them or prevent them from influencing decisions. And one piece of evidence that I'm not going to get bogged down on too much, but I'll give you a sort of cartoon version of what this is. Oh my goodness, I'm already losing power in one of my headsets. One piece of evidence, or one set of very systematic set of studies done by Calvin Lai and many other colleagues, had multiple labs all over the world, I think, or at least North America, mostly North America, testing out different methodologies for reducing implicit bias. And they were looking at that black, white, good, bad, the preference for whites over blacks at the implicit level, and looking at different strategies that had been proposed to reduce that. And they found that about half of the strategies, I won't get into the details of them, but about half of them had showed statistically significant reductions in bias from the baseline to after the strategy was employed. But the important part of this story is that in a follow-up study, they found that virtually all of these effective strategies, when measured 24 hours later, the biases were back to the baseline. And this is not at all surprising to social psychologists, because what we learned initially from cognitive psychology is that these implicit associations, these implicit stored memories, they get built up over the course of a lifetime. They serve a function, which is to help us make judgments under ambiguous situations, and they're not easily changed. And that seems to be borne out in the research where people try concerted efforts to reduce implicit bias. So what can we do? Which brings up the issue of implicit bias training in the police. And social psychologists like me have been arguing that police departments should not have a false sense of security, that they are actually reducing implicit bias when they do these trainings. The trainings, by the way, tend to be classroom-based. They tend to run for anywhere between 2 and 8 hours, and there's lecture slides and maybe some role playing, but rarely. And so finally, there was the opportunity to have a quasi-experimental approach to testing the effect of the industry leader implicit bias training in New York City. So this is something called fair and impartial policing. The Finn Institute in New York studied the effect of implicit bias training in New York City. And I apologize for this. This is straight out of their report, but I'm going to highlight things to make it a little bit clearer. Essentially, when you look at the actual field performance of NYPD officers and compare before the training to after the training, and what's nice about this is that they didn't all get the training at the same time. So this is able to compare some officers holding constant the time in history. And what we see is that if you compare before the training to after the training, we see that, for example, the percent of blacks who are stopped is actually slightly higher after the training. The percent of blacks who are, the percent of those who are frisked who are black is slightly higher after the training. Similar pattern for searches, for use of force. And then the only thing where we see pretty much a flat line is arrests, the percent of arrests, and the percent of use of force in arrests, although use of force in stops is higher after training than it was before. So this is pretty compelling evidence for what some of my colleagues and I had been saying was likely the outcome of this training, which is not evidence of actual changes in the racial distribution of who is policed in the field. So lest we become completely demoralized that there doesn't seem to be anything that can be done about this, I want to say that there is, from social psychology, a very robust, well-studied method for reducing implicit and explicit intergroup biases, and that's something called intergroup contact, which means actually putting people into contact with members of the other group in a manner that's at least neutral, if not positive, certainly not negative or competitive. And the research, which has been very carefully reviewed empirically, overwhelmingly shows that all kinds of intergroup contact, even when it's just imagined, lastingly reduces intergroup prejudices. But that's kind of a generational process. That's something that's fairly labor and time intensive to achieve. So we might want to think about things that can be done in the short term to reduce these racial disparities in criminal justice, particularly in policing. And I'm going to just quickly talk about a few of them, and then I'm going to focus in on reductions in discretion. But one piece of news to point out is that one obvious thing to do would be to blind or cloak people, or blind people to the racial categories of the people they're making judgments about. That was something that that George Gascon tried out in San Francisco when he was DA here. He's now DA in Los Angeles, and I don't know if he's instituted this there yet. That's something that's going to work very well for police, because policing is very interpersonal, and you really can't blind police to the identities of people that they're encountering. One thing that can be done, this is a little bit of a sidetrack, is to try to reduce the impact of policing on the stereotypes themselves. And I'm happy to say that Chief Scott I'm here in San Francisco, instituted a policy a few years back where he banned the release of mugshots or booking photos for people who had been arrested, in part recognizing due process and that they were presumed innocent at that time. But also recognizing that they were disproportionately people of color, and that releasing their mugshots was promoting racial stereotypes related to crime. And then just a year later, that became statewide law. But coming back to the things that we can do with respect to reducing the impact of bias on policing, I want to focus here on reducing discretion, and I want to describe some actual cases that provide good evidence that constraining officer discretion does in fact reduce disparities and seems to increase efficiency as well. So here's an interesting story where Raymond Kelly, who actually went on after this to be the commissioner of police in New York, but in this case took a very different, and he was responsible for that escalation of stop and frisk. But when he was director of US Customs, he took a different tack, and noticing that there were a lot of searches going on by customs at ports of entry. He noticed that there was a very broad set of criteria that were being used to decide who could be searched. And he reduced that from 43 criteria down to 6 that were much more empirically derived and behaviorally related. And what we see is that from before, if we compare the year before to the year after this policy change, so 1998 before and 2000 after, we see that the number of searches declined by a factor of about 4, about 75% reduction, which isn't surprising because the number of criteria was reduced by about 75%. But interestingly, the number of contraband yields resulting from those searches stayed about the same, so that the search yield rate quadrupled over that period. So you get roughly the same amount of criminal interdiction with a quarter as much encumbrance on civilians passing through. More interesting, I think, is that prior to the policy change, we see that Latinos, and a lot of this is occurring at the southern border, Latinos are being searched at very high rates. I don't know, I don't have a denominator to say what these rates actually are, but then numerically they're searched at a higher rate, but that their yield rate, the rate at which they're showing evidence of smuggling or other crimes, is dramatically lower than the yield rate for Blacks and whites who are searched at the border. After the policy change, the rate of searches gets more comparable, and their yield rate also becomes more comparable. So this is a very dramatic reduction in disparity without, and in this case, it's really a win-win situation because you don't see a reduction in criminal interdiction at the same time. Similarly, if we look at new data coming out of California, which now has the AB 953, the Racial and Identity Profiling Act, that requires all law enforcement agencies in the state to provide data to the Attorney General's office on who's being stopped and searched and among pedestrians and drivers. What we can see from the first wave of data, which was the 8 largest departments in the state, which are very large departments like California Highway Patrol, LAPD, and LA County Sheriffs, and San Francisco PD as well. what we see is if we look at these, what I'm describing as low discretion searches, which are things that are fairly compulsory. So one category of that is searches incident to arrest. If someone's being arrested, they have to be searched for the safety of the officer. And when they're compulsory, when there's less discretion on the part of the officer about who's being searched, yield rates for searches of whites, Blacks, and Hispanics are very comparable, and they tend to be relatively high. Among the higher discretion searches, which the most sort of archetypal, it would be the consent search, which is where there actually is not probable cause, but the officer operating on a hunch asks if they can search the individual. Here we see a pretty dramatic disparity between the yield rates, where white yield rates, kind of like we were seeing in the NYPD data, white yield rates are considerably higher than the Black and Hispanic yield rates, and overall the yield rates are lower. So this is again evidence from recent data in California showing that discretion seems to influence not only the fruitfulness of the searches, but the racial bias that's going into the searches. And then we can look back at that NYPD data because we have this natural experiment where we have a dramatic decline in stop and frisk from nearly 700,000 a year to down under 20,000 a year. So NYPD is doing something dramatically different in terms of who they're stopping and who they're frisking. And what we see here is that whereas at the peak of stop and frisk, the proportion of people who were, the ratio of the proportions of Blacks to whites who were found to have contraband per stop, actually I should say whites to Black, went from 1.4 to 1, so whites were 40% more likely to have contraband among those who were stopped and frisked. And then in the later period, you see an increase in those yield rates so that the searches are being a little more accurate. And that disparity goes down to 1.1 to 1, or a 10% differential. Similarly, for weapons per stop, we see the ratio goes from 1.8 to 1 down to almost identical rates. And actually Hispanics are showing now higher rates of weapons yields relative to whites and Blacks. So maybe before I finish there, this is evidence from US Customs, from the state of California, and from the largest police department in the country, if not the world, NYPD, showing that that constraints on discretion yield less disparate policing and less discriminatory outcomes. And I'll just put this slide back up there to say that there are other things that can be tried, but I'm focusing my research at this time on reducing discretion. And I will end it there and entertain questions. Matt, I know we have some questions in the chat.
We do, yeah, thank you, Jack. There's so much to think about. I wonder if it's really just putting discretionary measures in, not only into play, but also into language. Why is it that more departments aren't following this kind of method?
Fair question. One thing to bear in mind in all of this that I probably should have said up front is that there are 18,000 or so police departments in the United States, and they are locally regulated. There is no command and control from the US Department of Justice. These departments, most of them municipal police departments, but also state police and county sheriff's departments, they all get to set their own policies, and they are governed federally primarily by Supreme Court precedent. So the reasonable suspicion standard is in Supreme Court case law. The Miranda ruling that they have to be read their rights is in Supreme Court case law. A lot of the incentives that come from these Supreme Court rulings have to do with the exclusion of evidence. So the consequences for bad policing typically are mostly about the evidence that you find not being admissible at trial. Then we have qualified immunity, which means that even when police officers wrongly harm or take someone's life, the likelihood that they will personally be held accountable is very low. So there's this environment where there's overwhelmingly local regulation amongst many thousands of departments. And while you do have things like Peace Officer Standard in Training, or POST, which is California's, and almost every state has one of these, an organization that is a state-run organization that provides policy recommendations and some standards. They don't have the capacity to decertify officers or agencies and the like. And so it's really just, it's kind of up to the locals. And you do see initiative by many local police chiefs. Some of our own local Bay Area police chiefs are at the forefront of this, trying things out, although, as many great people as there are at the Oakland Police Department, much of the reforms had to come through court action. You see that spontaneous action by Chief Scott in San Francisco with the mugshots, and you have things like that happening. But it really, again, comes at the discretion of the leadership at the local level. Some of them are taking action. I work with a group called the Center for Policing Equity. That's a nonprofit organization that provides policy consulting and data analysis for police departments, and now works with hundreds of departments around the country. So there are things happening, but and California has passed the Racial and Identity Profiling Act and some other laws providing state regulatory guidance on policing. But nevertheless, overwhelmingly, it's a local thing, and it's up to the goodwill of the local authorities.
And it might take generational time too. Yeah, you have a couple of questions here, Jack. A couple of people would like to know if you've taken this research and these findings and brought it to police academies or teaching to police employee groups.
Right.
If you have, could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. Thank you for that question. I have, and also the Center for Policing Equity is doing that in a systematic sort of way. One of the things I do when I speak to criminal justice professionals, including police officers, is I start out by saying, this is not a training, because training implies that you are changing behavior. And I don't know that anything that I can say to them in a 1 hour or 90-minute lecture is going to actually change their behavior. And I also know now from the data that, now I'm losing power again. I'm going to take out my AirPods and you might hear my dogs. Okay, can you hear me? Okay, great. So, or you might hear my family. In the COVID era, this is what we get. So, so when I provide lectures to police audiences, I'm really careful to say, to talk about how the onus is on them to figure out their institutional changes that they have to make to reduce these disparities. And one of them is to rein in discretion. And I hit that point pretty hard. But what I'm also working on is getting the word out that the implicit bias trainings probably don't help, and even potentially have can cause a false sense of security that something has been done when in fact no effect has been caused. And then there's the opportunity cost. Oh, you can see one of my dogs here. There's the opportunity cost of the money that gets spent on that training and the time that gets spent on that training, as opposed to other things that it could be invested in. And so, so that's the bigger picture. But I do talk to police leaders and sometimes rank and file. They're generally quite receptive, but they also, the pushback is, and the typical pushback is, we're just going where the crime is. And their belief is that they are just responding to calls for service and just going where the crime is. But the reality is, and when you push them on this, it comes out that they are also doing a lot of proactive policing, making a lot of discretionary stops. In New York, you saw the number that was extremely high, but we see it in California as well, that a lot of the stops showing up in the data are what we call pretext stops, which are people being stopped for broken taillights, which are not really a concern of the officer, but it's a pretext to stop the person, ask them some questions, and then potentially search.
And so these are the things that I talk to them about to try to get them to reduce that behavior. Also noting that the public safety value of pretext stops is very low, and there's very little evidence that it yields public safety. So I do talk to them. Sometimes they're receptive. I prefer talking to the leadership because they're the ones who are in a position to actually change the incentives and change the operations and the policies. But I'll talk to any comers.
Well, yeah, that's great. You have a couple of questions here where people are interested in the data and they would like to learn a little bit about comparative data. So 2 questions here. Is and are there studies where the minority group is not Black Americans? 1, and 2, in terms of bias. And 2, are there differences between women and men officers in terms of implicit bias?
Yeah. Let me take the second one first, which is that there are big differences between women and men officers, but not in terms of implicit bias. Implicit bias is a pretty universal phenomenon. What's different appears, and there's a brand new study out on this, and I'll try to send the link out, showing that in fact, women and minority police officers make fewer arrests overall, use less force. So they're generally speaking, they're less aggressive in their policing. And I should say anecdotally that years ago, when I was at a meeting of the Center for Policing Equity, where we had social scientists and police chiefs together in the room shooting around ideas, one former chief from a major city police department, out of the blue, kind of stood up and said, you know, to the day, my department became professionalized when the first women came on the roll. And so there is a professionalizing element to gender diversification of police departments. The challenge is that if you just have a few minority or women officers, it's very difficult for them to change the culture of the organization. And there's actually an organization called 30 by 30, which is run by women leaders in law enforcement who are advocating for departments to make a commitment to having at least 30% of their force be women by the year 2030. So that's a very real thing. The other question was about.
Let me read Jim's question in full. So he asks, have there been studies of implicit bias in other cultures where the minority group is not Black?
Yeah. So absolutely. One of the studies I put up on that slide was the employment study that was done in Sweden, where it was found that HR people in Swedish companies showed an implicit bias in favor of people with Swedish names compared to people with Arab names. There's a considerable Arab immigrant population in Sweden, and that implicit bias correlated with their likelihood of inviting somebody in for an interview when they'd received a resume that was equal in every respect, except that at the top, the name was an Arab sounding or a Swedish ethnic sounding name. So we see that in another country with a completely different immigrant group. We see it if you go to projectimplicit.org. You'll see that implicit bias has been measured along many dimensions, probably just there on 100 or so. I know of one study that has 98 different implicit bias dimensions, some of which are intergroup, some of which are like implicit preference for Coke versus Pepsi or Democrats versus Republicans, but much of it is gender, and some of it is very stereotype specific, like the Gender Science Association, the Male-Female Science versus Humanities Association. These are all things that can drive disparities one way or another. But these are studied in lots of different ways. But underlying, I think the subtext of the question is a point very well taken, which is that overwhelmingly the research on prejudice in general has been skewed toward studying anti-Black prejudice in America, and there are good reasons for that. That being, the scar of race in America and the specter of slavery and the causes of anti-Black racial bias. But it has been to the exclusion of sufficient research on other minority groups. The principles generally translate, they generally generalize from, especially in terms of implicit bias, the general idea that we store memories, we store mental associations between concepts like groups and traits or evaluations. We do that, and it's not specific to any particular group. We do it for every group that we have stored in our memories as a group. So it does generalize, but there are some groups for which the stereotypes are particularly strong and negative. And the horrible history of America is that the stereotypes and the general affective evaluative bias toward Blacks are very negative. And then there's this very specific Black crime, Black weapon association that is particularly influential in policing. So
Laura has a follow-up question here. She wonders whether the race of the officer comes into play with respect to implicit bias. So if it's a white officer or Black officer, Latino officer.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. It does and it doesn't. So it does to the extent that, again, if you go to Project Implicit and you download some data from there, what you'll see is that white Americans, about 80% of white Americans exhibit anti-Black, pro-white implicit bias. And for Black Americans, it's split about 50-50. So that's interesting that the average Black American is less biased against Blacks, but it's also surprising that they don't show an in-group favoritism bias. They tend to be sort of split. And so that's interesting unto itself. And so one should expect that, minority police officers, to the extent that they're going to have less negative attitudes toward their own group, are going to behave in a less biased manner toward their own group. That seems to show up. The literature is a little mixed. The research literature is a little mixed, but that seems to show up with respect to how they act toward people, the quality of their interactions toward people from their own group. But in terms of use of force, well, and in use of force, but in terms of arrest rates, it's hard to see a big difference there. And I think the main reason there, again, is the difference between the general prejudice, the good bad association, and the specific stereotype association, the crime race association. And that, unfortunately, is driven a lot by media exposure, which Black and Hispanic Americans are exposed to as well. And then, of course, Black and Hispanic and Asian police officers are not a random representative sample of Black, Hispanic, and Asian Americans. They are self-selecting into policing, and there are some ideological components to that. And that was my dog yawning. I hope you heard it.
Why don't we take this as a final question then? You mentioned media, and Avi has waited a long time for this question to be asked, but it's a good time now. So he states, advertising researchers still entertain the old contrast between hard and soft theories of influence, where mass media isn't really supposed to have much of effect on people. Can you address that assumption or let us know a little bit more about the effect of media?
I don't know that I can speak to that sort of deep theoretical question. I think it's a little above my pay grade on the media science front. What I can say is that social psychologists like Keith Maddox and others have looked at the effect of news media representations of crime on public perceptions of race groups, and have found that even when the media representations are proportional to the actual population representation, those merely seeing some representations of Black criminals tends to reinforce the Black crime stereotype. And that is consistent, again, with the psychological theory of stereotyping and prejudice, which is that there's another dimension to it, which is something called the outgroup homogeneity effect, which is that we have a tendency to overestimate the homogeneity of other groups and overestimate the heterogeneity of our own groups. And the effect of that is that the stereotypes of other groups tend to be stronger. So when we see stereotype confirming information, it gets encoded more readily. and is harder to disconfirm. And so the media representations where you have a well-seated stereotype like race and crime, the media representations, I think, are going to be more effective than maybe the more general kinds of media representations that one would be looking at to see if you get public influence on that. So that's about as much as I can say on that with any research background.
Well, Jack, thank you so much for today. You have given us a lot to think about and a little bit to hope for as well. And we appreciate that too. So thank you everyone for joining us. This has been Friday Special Events with Jack Glaser.
Thank you. It's been my